They stole my land, but I stole their future. When I returned from London to find 120 luxury homes on my family's desert property, the HOA president smirked, lawyers laughed, and residents eyed me like a trespasser. But they forgot one thing. I'm a forensic accountant who spent 15 years dismantling fraud. What they called progress was a $50 million scam, and every brick they laid became evidence. By morning, their fortress would be my crime scene. Picture this. 120 luxurious homes suddenly sprouting on your property like mushrooms after rain. The HOA president smirking. Lawyers and expensive suits laughing at your naive mistake. Well, they forgot one tiny detail. I'm a forensic accountant who specializes in property fraud for 15 years. By the way, where are you watching from? Drop your city below. I bet your HOA horror stories are just as wild. What they didn't know is that every brick they laid was building their own prison. Let me tell you how I turned their greed into the most satisfying legal trap ever. The morning I returned from my 6-month consulting project in London, the Arizona sun felt extra welcoming on my face. My Aunt Margaret didn't just leave me land, she left me a war. For years, she'd mailed me newspaper clippings about accidental fires and elderly neighbors forced into shady deals. They're coming for the desert, Brian, her last letter warned. But even she couldn't have imagined 120 houses waiting for me that day. The Uber driver kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror as we approached what should have been empty desert land. Sir, are you sure this is the right address? This looks like a whole new development, he said, slowing down. My heart sank as I saw row after row of identical beige houses where my aunt's wildflower fields should have been. 120 homes, complete with manicured lawns and HOA-approved mailboxes, stood on my property. The Emerald Heights community sign mocked me with its pristine gold lettering. I paid the driver and walked straight to the sales office where a perky blonde realtor jumped up to greet me. Welcome to Emerald Heights. Are you interested in our Phase 2 homes? We're 70% sold already. I pulled out my property deed. I'm interested in knowing why there are houses on my land. Her smile faltered, then brightened again. Oh, you must be Mr. Jordan. Melanie Ross, our HOA president, has been expecting you. She said you might have some confusion about the development agreement. The sales office was a testament to suburban excess. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and walls covered with architectural renderings of an even larger development. Phase 2 apparently would include a golf course and country club on my land. The realtor, whose name tag read Brittany, nervously tapped at her computer. Mrs. Ross said to send you right up if you arrived. Her office is on the second floor of the administration building. She pointed toward a gleaming glass structure that looked more like a corporate headquarters than an HOA office. As I walked through the development, I noticed the details that my forensic accountants I automatically cataloged. The streets were named after precious gems: Sapphire Lane, Ruby Court, Diamond Drive. Each house had the same beige stucco exterior with slight variations in trim color. The landscaping was immaculate, but sterile with not a leaf out of place. Residents were out walking dogs or jogging, all eyeing me suspiciously. I was clearly an outsider in what had been my own property. Melanie's laugh was polished poison. You're not the first heir to show up with a deed, Mr. Jordan. The last one? He's still paying legal fees when he's not drowning in bourbon. She slid a contract toward me. Sign, and maybe you'll keep your kneecaps. She was 52 with perfectly styled silver hair and the predatory smile of someone who'd gotten away with murder before. Behind her desk hung her law degree from Stanford and several civic awards strategically placed to intimidate visitors. Brian, so glad you could finally join us, she purred, sliding a thick folder across her mahogany desk. As you can see, we sent multiple notices to your registered address about the development plans. When we received no response, we proceeded according to the HOA bylaws your aunt agreed to when Emerald Heights was first established in 1998. She opened the folder, revealing page after page of legal documents, certified mail receipts, and public notices. Everything was done by the book, I assure you. But registered address? I asked, flipping through the papers. My blood ran cold when I saw it. 1223 Maple Drive, my aunt's old house that had been demolished 2 years ago after she passed. The certified mail receipts all showed delivery attempted. No such address. Melanie's eyes glinted with satisfaction. The address on file with the HOA. We followed proper protocol, Brian. Every notice, every deadline, every opportunity for you to object, all properly documented and sent to that address. She leaned back in her leather chair. I understand this might be overwhelming, but the development is a fait accompli now. Perhaps we can discuss compensation for your cooperation. I studied her face, noting the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth, a tell I'd seen in countless fraud investigations. You knew that address was no longer valid, I said quietly. Her smile never wavered. We are required to use the address on file. It's not our responsibility to track down property owners who failed to update their contact information. She pulled out another document. Your aunt signed this HOA agreement in 1998, clearly stating that all official communications would be sent to the address of record. I stood up, keeping my poker face intact, a skill honed from years of investigating financial fraud. I'll need time to review these documents with my attorney. Melanie's smile widened. Of course, but I should mention that fighting this would be expensive and futile. We have the backing of Morrison Keller and Associates. You might have heard of them. I had. They were the legal bulldogs who'd crushed 3 environmental groups trying to stop a pipeline last year. As I left her office, I overheard her telling her assistant, "He'll fold. They always do." Walking back through the development, I noticed more details. Security cameras on every corner, a private security patrol car making rounds, the entrance gate with a guard station. This wasn't just a housing development. It was a fortress. My aunt's 50 acres had been transformed into a controlled environment where every aspect of life was regulated. I stopped at the spot where her favorite oak tree used to stand. Now it was a decorative fountain surrounded by benches bolted to concrete. That night, I sat in my hotel room, surrounded by papers and my laptop, doing what I did best, following the money. Something about Melanie's confidence bothered me. It wasn't just arrogance. It was the certainty of someone who'd done this before. I started with public records, and within hours, I'd found my first breadcrumb. Melanie Ross, formerly Melanie Ross Hutchinson. Buried in Aunt Margaret's files was a dog-eared law textbook, a page corner folded at Whitmore versus Henderson, a 19th century case about railroad land grabs. She'd scribbled in the margin, "Greedy men always forget. The law cuts both ways." Attorney registration suspended in 2016 for conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. The plot was thickening, and I hadn't even started digging into the HOA's finances yet. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Heard you're back in town. If you want the real story about Emerald Heights, meet me at Java Junction tomorrow at 10 a.m. A friend." I smiled. In my experience, anonymous friends usually meant someone with a guilty conscience or a score to settle. Either way, they often had the best information. I texted back a simple, "I'll be there," and returned to my research. By 3 a.m., I'd mapped out 15 other properties that had mysteriously ended up under Emerald Heights control in the past 5 years. The pattern was clear. Elderly owners, out-of-state heirs, and always those notices sent to outdated addresses. Java Junction was a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the regulars knew everyone and strangers stood out like sore thumbs. It was deliberately chosen, I realized, far enough from Emerald Heights to avoid surveillance, busy enough to provide cover. I arrived early, ordered a black coffee, and chose a corner booth with a view of the entrance. The morning crowd was a mix of construction workers grabbing breakfast and retirees solving the world's problems over unlimited refills. At exactly 10 a.m., a young woman in a crisp navy suit walked in, scanning the room nervously. When our eyes met, she nodded slightly and approached. Mr. Jordan, I'm Allison West. I think I can help you with your situation. She slid into the booth across from me, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her briefcase. Up close, I could see the dark circles under her eyes, partially hidden by carefully applied makeup. This was someone who hadn't been sleeping well. I used to work for Melanie, she began, keeping her voice low. Fresh out of law school, I thought I'd landed my dream job with a successful attorney. She was brilliant, charismatic, everything I wanted to be. Allison pulled out a folder. Then I discovered what she was really doing. The Emerald Heights HOA isn't just a homeowners association. It's a sophisticated property acquisition scheme. Melanie targets vulnerable properties, uses obscure HOA bylaws to justify takeover, then partners with developers to flip the land for massive profits. She opened the folder revealing meticulously organized documents, emails, financial records, internal memos. I started noticing discrepancies about 6 months into the job. Properties being added to the HOA jurisdiction without proper authorization. Elderly homeowners signing documents they didn't understand. Forged signatures on critical paperwork. Her voice hardened. When I brought my concerns to Melanie, she laughed. Said I was being naive, that this was how business was done in the real world. I leaned forward. Why come to me? Why not report this to the authorities? Allison's laugh was bitter. I tried, but Melanie's connected. She's got judges, city councilors, even some FBI agents in her pocket. When I threatened to expose her, she had me blacklisted. Said I was a disgruntled employee making false accusations. No firm in 3 states will hire me now. She pushed the folder toward me. But I kept copies of everything, including proof that she knew your aunt had passed away when she sent those notices. She pulled out a specific email dated 3 months before I received notification about the development. Look at this exchange between Melanie and her assistant. She explicitly mentions that the old woman is dead and instructs her team to proceed with sending notices to the invalid address. She even jokes about it, calls it fishing in a dry pond. I read the email chain, my anger building with each word. The callousness was breathtaking. The documents were damning. Email threads between Melanie and her developer partner Jim, the Hammer, Harrison discussing how to expedite the takeover of my land. Financial records showing millions in offshore accounts. But most interesting was a technical report about environmental assessments. Was this about soil contamination? I asked. Allison smiled for the first time. That's your ace in the hole. Melanie was in such a rush to build. She skipped proper environmental testing. Those houses, they're sitting on land that needed remediation first. Every single building permit was obtained fraudulently. There's more, Allison continued, pulling out another set of documents. Your aunt wasn't just some random target. She'd been fighting Melanie for years. Look at these letters. Correspondence between your aunt and various regulatory agencies. Complaints filed with the State Bar Association. Even a private investigator's report. I scanned the documents, seeing my aunt's familiar handwriting on letter after letter. She'd known exactly what was happening and had been building a case. Over the next 2 hours, Allison laid out the entire operation. The HOA would identify properties with absent or deceased owners, send legally required notices to addresses they knew were invalid, then use the lack of response to claim abandonment rights under an obscure clause in the original HOA charter. They partner with Jim Harrison's development company, build quickly using substandard materials and shortcuts, then sell to unsuspecting buyers before anyone could challenge the legality. They've done this to 15 other properties, she said. But you're different. You have the expertise to unravel this, and more importantly, you came back before they could sell all the houses. The timing is critical, she explained, pulling out a timeline she'd created. Melanie usually waits at least a year after taking possession before anyone realizes what's happened. By then, she's sold most of the units, created a complex web of ownership, and made it virtually impossible to unwind the transactions. But you showed up just 6 months in. She's sold some units, but not enough to make the situation irreversible. That's why she's panicking. Why should I trust you? I asked, studying her face. This could still be an elaborate trap. Allison met my gaze steadily. Because I'm the reason you inherited that land in the first place. Your aunt was my mentor in law school. She knew what Melanie was planning and changed her will specifically to leave the property to someone who could fight back. She always said you were the smartest person in the family, that you'd see what others missed. She pulled out a handwritten letter. She left this for you in case something like this happened. My aunt's familiar handwriting blurred as I read. Dear Brian, if you're reading this, then Melanie Ross has made her move. I've watched her circle like a vulture for years, waiting for me to die. The land isn't just property, it's evidence. Look beneath the old oak tree near the creek. I've buried something that will help you bring her down. Trust Allison. She's one of the good ones. Love, Aunt Margaret. I folded the letter carefully. Looks like we have some digging to do. There's something else you need to know, Allison said as we prepared to leave. Melanie's not working alone. She's part of a network that extends across multiple states. The Emerald Heights model has been replicated in Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah. They're targeting retirement communities, areas with aging populations, anywhere they can exploit property laws and HOA regulations. Your aunt figured this out, which is why she became such a threat. She wasn't just protecting her own land. She was trying to expose a multi-state criminal enterprise. That afternoon, armed with shovels and determination, Allison and I found my aunt's insurance policy, a waterproof box containing original HOA documents, recorded conversations, and a diary detailing every suspicious activity she'd observed. But the real bombshell was a set of geological surveys from 1997 showing natural gas deposits under the property. That's why Melanie wants the land so badly, Allison whispered. It's not just about the houses. She's planning to sell the mineral rights to Excelsior Energy for $50 million once she has full control. I spent the evening creating a comprehensive timeline of Melanie's fraud. The pattern was clear, but patterns weren't enough for court. I needed admissible evidence, and I needed Melanie to incriminate herself. That's when inspiration struck. Allison, how would you like to play double agent? I asked. She raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? I outlined my plan. Allison would approach Melanie, claiming she wanted back in, that she could help manage the Brian Jordan problem. Meanwhile, I'd play the overwhelmed heir, ready to settle for pennies on the dollar. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a gleaming building that my money had apparently paid for. The room was packed with residents, most glaring at me like I was the villain in this story. Melanie stood at the podium, radiating confidence in her power suit. Thank you all for coming on short notice, she began. As you know, we have a situation regarding the ownership claims made by Mr. Brian Jordan. She gestured toward me. While we sympathize with his confusion, the fact remains that this development was built legally and in good faith. I stood up, playing my part perfectly. I just want what's fair, I said, letting my voice shake slightly. My aunt left me this land, and now there are houses on it. I don't want to displace families, but surely there's some compensation due. The crowd murmured sympathetically. Some for me, most against. Melanie's smile was patronizing. Of course, Brian, we're prepared to offer you $200,000 for any residual claims you might have. That's more than generous considering the development was approved through proper channels. $200,000? I repeated, then looked down at my papers as if considering. The land was worth at least $5 million undeveloped. Melanie's eyes flashed. Was worth, Mr. Jordan. Past tense. The situation has changed. That's when Jim Harrison stood up from the front row. He was a large man with the kind of tan that came from golf courses, not construction sites. Look, buddy, he drawled. You can take the offer or you can spend the next 10 years in court. Your choice. I let the silence stretch, then pulled out my phone. Before I decide, there's something everyone should hear. Played the recording Allison had made yesterday when she'd met with Melanie. Melanie's voice filled the room. Of course, I knew the old bat was dead. That's why I sent the notices there. Brian Jordan was in London, probably sipping tea and eating crumpets. By the time he figured it out, we'd have everything locked down tight. The room erupted. Residents started shouting questions. Melanie's face went from red to white. That's taken out of context, she stammered. But I wasn't done. I also have copies of the real environmental reports, the ones showing contamination levels 3 times the legal limit. The ones you hid from these families who bought homes here. Now the residents were on their feet demanding answers. Jim Harrison tried to slip out the side door, but found it blocked by Connell Lewis, my next-door neighbor from childhood, who'd become one of Emerald Heights residents. I don't think so, Jim, Connell said firmly. We all need to hear this. Melanie tried to regain control. This is ridiculous. He's obviously fabricated these recordings. I'll be filing defamation charges first thing tomorrow. But the doubt was spreading through the room like wildfire. I pulled out more documents. Speaking of legal issues, does anyone know that HOA funds have been used to pay for Melanie's personal legal defense in 3 separate fraud cases? Or that the construction company that built your homes has filed for bankruptcy twice under different names? The meeting descended into chaos. Melanie fled to her office with Jim close behind. Several residents cornered me, demanding to know more. How deep does this go? Asked a young father, holding a baby. Are our homes safe? I chose my words carefully. I'm working with authorities to get to the bottom of this. Your homes are structurally sound, but there are issues that need addressing. I promise you, my fight isn't with any of you. It's with the people who defrauded all of us. That night, Allison called with news. Melanie's panicking. She's moving money to offshore accounts and shredding documents. But here's the interesting part. She called someone she referred to as the senator, told him the situation was getting out of control. I smiled grimly. Good. Panicked people make mistakes. What about our federal friends? Allison's voice was excited. The FBI agent you contacted? He's very interested. Turns out they've been building a case against Jim Harrison for money laundering, but couldn't connect him to Melanie until now. As I hung up, my laptop dinged with an email from an anonymous address. Back off or things will get very unpleasant for you. You don't know who you're dealing with. Attached was a photo of my house in Boston. I forwarded it straight to the FBI and texted Allison, looks like we're rattling the right cages. Her response was immediate. Melanie just offered me $1 million to steal your evidence and disappear. Want me to take it? I laughed out loud. Absolutely. Let's see how she plans to pay you. The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Melanie had filed an emergency injunction to stop me from harassing residents and spreading false information, but she'd made a critical error. In her haste, she'd included financial documents that actually supported my claims. Her lawyer, a nervous young man who kept adjusting his tie, realized the mistake too late. Judge Patricia Rees, known for her no-nonsense approach to property law, raised an eyebrow as she reviewed the file. Counselor, did you actually read these attachments before submitting them? The young lawyer, whose name tag read Kevin Marsh, turned crimson. Your Honor, we filed these documents under extreme time pressure. My client felt it was urgent to protect the community from. Judge Reeves cut him off. From what exactly? From learning the truth about their homes? I'm looking at bank statements here that show systematic transfers from HOA accounts to offshore entities. Is your client aware that financial disclosure in court filings is subject to perjury laws? Melanie, sitting at the defendant's table, was frantically whispering to a senior partner who'd just arrived. Richard Blackstone, the infamous shark of Arizona real estate law, stood smoothly. Your Honor, if I may take over for my colleague, there's been a misunderstanding about the scope of these documents. But Judge Reeves was having none of it. Mr. Blackstone, I don't care if you're replacing counsel. These documents are now part of the public record. They show clear evidence of financial irregularities that warrant investigation. Meanwhile, Melanie was moving faster than a cat on a hot roof. She'd managed to sell 80 of the 120 homes to unsuspecting buyers, pushing through closings at breakneck speed. But instead of stopping her, I let her dig her hole deeper. Each sale created another victim, another person with standing to sue her. Each rushed closing meant more paperwork errors, evidence of fraud. Allison, playing her part perfectly, was feeding me inside information while pretending to help Melanie cover her tracks. That afternoon, I visited the county recorder's office with the forensic auditor I'd hired, Patricia Newen. She specialized in real estate fraud and had worked with the FBI on several high-profile cases. As we pored over the deeds and transfer documents, Patricia whistled low. "Brian, this is worse than we thought. Look at these signatures." She pointed to a series of documents. Same notary on all of them, but the notary's license expired 3 years ago. Every single one of these sales is legally questionable. I studied the papers more closely. And look at the timing. All these closings happened within a 72-hour period. No legitimate real estate operation processes this many sales that quickly without proper due diligence. Patricia nodded. It's a clear pattern of fraudulent conveyance. She's trying to create so many individual property claims that it becomes impossible to unwind the transactions. Classic asset protection strategy, but executed so sloppily it's actually creating more evidence. She's getting desperate, Allison reported during one of our clandestine meetings at a truck stop outside town. She's pressuring buyers to close without proper inspections, offering huge discounts for cash deals, and I think she's forging signatures on disclosure forms. She handed me a flash drive. I copied everything before she could destroy it, including emails where she explicitly tells Jim to use substandard materials to cut costs. Oh, and there's something else. She pulled out a folder marked conf. These are internal HOA communications about something called Project Clean Sweep. Apparently, Melanie's been planning to demolish the original section of Emerald Heights, where your aunt's house used to be, and build a luxury resort. The environmental contamination was going to be her excuse to condemn the properties and force sales at below market rates. I felt my anger rising. So she pollutes the land, uses that pollution to force people out, then profits from redevelopment. Allison nodded grimly. Exactly. And she's been using HOA funds to pay off environmental inspectors to look the other way. The corruption ran deeper than I'd imagined. I spent the rest of the day creating a detailed flowchart of Melanie's operations, tracking the money through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. By evening, I had mapped out connections to 3 city council members, 2 state legislators, and a federal judge. The pattern was clear. Melanie had built a network of corruption that reached into every level of government. But networks have a weakness. They're only as strong as their weakest link. That evening, I received a call from Special Agent David Chin of the FBI. "Mr. Jordan, we've been monitoring the situation. We'd like to meet." 2 hours later, I sat in a nondescript office building, looking at a wall covered with photos and documents, a sprawling web with Melanie and Jim at the center. "We've been investigating Harrison for 18 months, Jim explained. But Ross was always too clever, too careful. Until now." He pointed to a photo of a distinguished-looking man with silver hair. "Senator William Thornton. We believe he's been providing political cover for their operations in exchange for campaign contributions." "The senator," I said, remembering Allison's intelligence. Chin nodded. "Exactly. Your evidence could be the key to bringing down the entire network, but we need you to do something risky." He outlined their plan. I would meet with Melanie wearing a wire and offer to settle. The goal was to get her to admit to the broader conspiracy. "She's smart," I warned. She'll be suspicious. Chin smiled grimly. That's why we're going to make her think she's winning. The trap was set for Friday afternoon, but Thursday night, everything almost fell apart. Jim Harrison, perhaps smarter or more paranoid than we'd given him credit for, smelled a rat. He confronted Allison in the HOA office after hours, accusing her of being a spy. The confrontation turned physical when he grabbed her arm. What Jim didn't know was that Allison had been recording everything on her phone. His threats, his admission that they had dealt with problems like Brian before, and most damningly, his boast that the senator will bury all of you. Allison managed to escape and drove straight to the FBI office. By Friday morning, we had a new problem. Jim had vanished along with $5 million from the HOA accounts. Melanie was beyond panic now. She was desperate, which made her dangerous, but also sloppy. When I walked into her office that afternoon, wearing a wire under my shirt, she didn't even pretend to be cordial. "What do you want, Jordan?" she snarled. The polished facade was gone, replaced by raw survival instinct. "I want to end this," I said calmly. "You've sold most of the houses. You've made your money. I'll take 10 million and sign whatever you need." Her eyes narrowed. 10 million? You're out of your mind. But I could see her calculating, weighing the cost against the risk. 5 million, she countered. "And you sign an NDA. You never speak about this again." I pretended to consider, then shook my head. 8 million, and I want it in cash tonight. She laughed, but it was a brittle sound. "Cash? What do you think this is, a movie?" But I could see the wheels turning. Cash meant no paper trail. Cash meant she could pay me with the money Jim had stolen. "I know who took the HOA funds," I said quietly. "I also know you have access to other accounts, offshore accounts in the Caymans, perhaps." Her face went white. "How do you?" She caught herself, but it was too late. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You're going to pay me 8 million in cash. I'm going to disappear, and you're going to pray I stay gone." For a moment, I thought she might call my bluff. Then her shoulders sagged. "Tonight, 10 p.m., the old warehouse on Route 47. Come alone." News of the HOA's missing funds spread through Emerald Heights like wildfire. By Saturday morning, panicked residents were gathering in clusters, demanding answers. I called an impromptu meeting at the community center, this time with a very different tone. "I know you're worried," I began, looking at the sea of anxious faces. "You've invested your life savings in these homes. You're afraid you'll lose everything." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I want you to know that my fight is with Melanie Ross and Jim Harrison, not with you. In fact, I need your help to make sure justice is served." I explained the situation in simple terms. How Melanie had defrauded multiple property owners, how the homes were built on illegally obtained land, but how the residents themselves were innocent victims. "Here's my proposal," I said. "If you're willing to testify about any irregularities you've noticed, pressure to close quickly, missing inspections, unusual fees, I'll guarantee that your home ownership won't be challenged. Furthermore, any damages awarded will go into a fund to address the environmental issues and ensure your property values are protected." The response was overwhelming. 90% of the homeowners agreed to cooperate. Stories poured out, forged documents, threats, bribes. One elderly couple revealed that Melanie had convinced them to invest their entire retirement savings in a special HOA fund that guaranteed returns of 15%. Another family discovered their home inspection had been completed before the house was even built. Each story added another brick to the wall of evidence we were building. That evening, as I prepared for the warehouse meeting, my phone rang. It was Melanie. "Change of plans," she said, her voice strained. "I'll have someone deliver the money to your hotel." I could hear the fear in her voice. She suspected a trap. "No deal," I replied firmly. "Face to face, or I go public with everything tomorrow morning." The silence stretched for long seconds. "Fine," she spat. "But I'm bringing security." I smiled. "Bring whoever you want. Just bring my money." The warehouse was a cavernous space that had once stored agricultural equipment. Now it sat empty, a perfect setting for clandestine meetings. I arrived early, checking for alternate exits and hiding spots. The FBI had wanted to wire the place, but I'd convinced them to stay back. Melanie would bolt at the first sign of law enforcement. Instead, I wore a new wire, state-of-the-art equipment that could transmit even through concrete walls. At exactly 10 p.m., headlights swept across the dusty windows. Melanie entered with two large men who looked like they bench pressed small cars for fun. She carried a duffel bag that looked promisingly heavy. $8 million, she said without preamble, dropping the bag at my feet. Count it if you want. I unzipped the bag, revealing stacks of $100 bills. Looks about right, I said casually. Now about that NDA. Melanie pulled out a document. Sign it, take your money, and disappear. If I ever see you again, if you ever breathe a word about this to anyone, you'll... What? I interrupted. Have me killed like you did with Thomas Brennan? Her face went ashen. Thomas Brennan was a journalist who'd been investigating HOA corruption 3 years ago. His death had been ruled an accident. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, but her security guards exchanged nervous glances. Really? I pulled out my phone, showing her a photo. Because I have a very interesting email where you discuss permanently solving the Brennan problem with someone named Victor. That's when everything happened at once. One of her security guards reached for his gun. The warehouse doors burst open. FBI agents swarmed in, weapons drawn. Melanie screamed and tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. As they cuffed her, she looked at me with pure hatred. You set me up, she shrieked. You'll pay for this. I actually think you're the one who's going to pay. By the way, that money you brought? It's marked. The serial numbers were recorded when Jim withdrew it from the HOA account. As they led her away, she turned one last time. You don't understand. This is bigger than me. They'll come after you. As the FBI hauled Melanie away, her scream chilled me. You think you've won? The senator's just the start. My phone buzzed, an unknown number. Check your hotel balcony, the text read. Outside, a single bullet casing glinted in the moonlight. The news of Melanie's arrest spread quickly. By morning, 3 city council members had resigned and Senator Thornton's office had issued a statement denying any connection to the Emerald Heights scandal. Sure, I thought, just like you deny knowing about those campaign contributions. The federal courthouse was packed for Melanie's preliminary hearing. The government had charged her with 37 counts of fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and racketeering. Jim Harrison had been caught at the Mexican border with a fake passport and was quickly rolled by the FBI, agreeing to testify against Melanie in exchange for a reduced sentence. But the real shock came when the prosecutor announced they were also investigating a sitting U.S. senator for corruption. The media went into a frenzy. I took the stand on the third day, walking the court through my investigation. The defense attorney, Richard Blackstone, was known as the Shark, a ruthless litigator who'd never lost a real estate fraud case. He approached me with a predatory smile, his $3,000 suit impeccably tailored. Mr. Jordan, he began smoothly, isn't it true that you have a personal vendetta against my client? That this entire situation is merely an elaborate scheme to extort money from a successful businesswoman? I met his gaze calmly. No, counselor. I orchestrated this situation to expose a criminal enterprise that had stolen millions from innocent people. The only extortion here was perpetrated by your client. Blackstone's smile never wavered. You claim to be a forensic accountant, yet you engaged in deceptive practices, including wearing a wire and pretending to accept a bribe. How is that different from entrapment? Allison, sitting at the prosecution table, passed a note to the lead prosecutor. He stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant initiated the bribe attempt as clearly shown in the evidence. Judge Carter sustained the objection, but Blackstone wasn't deterred. He spent the next hour trying to paint me as a calculating opportunist, but each attack only allowed me to present more evidence of Melanie's crimes. The real bombshell came when I presented my legal theory. Your Honor, I began, standing to address the court directly. I'd like to draw the court's attention to the case of Whitmore versus Henderson, 1896. Blackstone jumped up. Relevance, Your Honor. We're not here to discuss century-old property disputes. But Judge Carter was intrigued. I'll allow it. Continue. Mr. Jordan. I pulled out a leather-bound law book, a theatrical touch, but effective. In Whitmore versus Henderson, the state Supreme Court ruled that any structure built on private land without the owner's explicit permission becomes the property of the landowner regardless of the builder's investment or intent. This precedent was upheld in Morrison versus State 1952 and again in Consolidated Developers versus Williams 1998. The courtroom was dead silent. Furthermore, I continued, Arizona revised Statute 42 to 173 clearly states that improvements made in bad faith cannot be claimed by the trespasser. The statute specifically mentions fraudulent conveyance of property rights as grounds for forfeiture. Blackstone was frantically flipping through his notes. Your Honor, this is absurd. These are antiquated laws that haven't been applied in decades. Judge Carter leaned forward. Actually, Counselor, Whitmore versus Henderson was cited just last year in Peterson versus Maricopa County. Please continue. Mr. Jordan. I smiled slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. By combining these precedents with the evidence of fraud, we can establish that not only did Miss Ross commit criminal acts, but she also inadvertently transferred ownership of all improvements, all 120 homes, to me as the rightful landowner. The prosecution team looked stunned. Even Allison seemed surprised, though we discussed the strategy. Blackstone was turning red. This is preposterous. You can't seriously suggest that my client built 120 homes only to lose them on a technicality. I turned to face him directly. It's not a technicality, counselor. It's the law. The same law your client tried to manipulate for her own gain. Melanie grabbed Blackstone's arm, hissing loud enough for the court reporter to hear. Do something. Call the senator. Tell him if I go down, I'm taking everyone with me. The judge's gavel came down hard. Order. Ms. Ross, you will refrain from making threats in my courtroom. But the damage was done. Within hours, Senator Thornton's office was raided by the FBI. The next phase of the trial focused on environmental fraud. I presented evidence showing that Melanie had paid off inspectors to overlook contamination that made the land unsuitable for residential development without extensive remediation. The irony, I told the court, is that in her rush to profit, Ms. Ross actually increased the liability exposure exponentially under the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. She's now personally responsible for cleanup costs estimated at $30 million. Blackstone tried one last desperate gambit. Your Honor, even if we accept Mr. Jordan's interpretation of property law, which we don't, surely the innocent homeowners who purchased these properties in good faith have some rights. It was exactly the opening I'd been waiting for. Absolutely, counselor. That's why I'm proposing a settlement where I sell each home back to its current occupant at their original purchase price, minus any fraudulent fees or kickbacks. All profits will go into a remediation fund and victim restitution program. Judge Carter nodded approvingly. A remarkably equitable solution, Mr. Jordan. Ms. West, does your client support this proposal? Allison stood, every inch the competent attorney. We do, Your Honor. My client's primary concern has always been justice for the victims of this fraud, not personal enrichment. The judge turned to the prosecution. Does the government have any objection to this framework being incorporated into a potential plea agreement? The lead prosecutor stood. No objection, Your Honor. In fact, we believe Mr. Jordan's proposal could serve as a model for resolving similar cases of systematic HOA fraud. Melanie suddenly stood up, knocking her chair over. This is a kangaroo court. You're all in on it. The senator promised me protection. He said the fix was in. Her outburst sealed her fate. The judge ordered her removed from the courtroom and revoked her bail. As order was restored, I presented my final piece of evidence, a detailed financial analysis showing how Melanie had used a web of shell companies to launder money through the HOA. Your Honor, this chart demonstrates that over the past 5 years, approximately $47 million flowed through these accounts with patterns consistent with classic money laundering operations. The forensic accountant in me had saved the best for last. The judge called a recess to review the evidence. When court reconvened, her ruling was decisive. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, and particularly in light of Ms. Ross's own admissions made in this courtroom, I find sufficient grounds to proceed with all charges. Furthermore, I'm granting the plaintiff's motion regarding property ownership subject to the proposed restitution framework. As we left the courthouse, Allison turned to me with admiration. That was brilliant. How long have you been planning this? I smiled. Since the day I found out about Whitmore versus Henderson. Sometimes the best trap is the one your enemy builds for themselves. Melanie was so focused on exploiting technicalities that she never considered they might be used against her. The evening news led with footage of Melanie in handcuffs screaming about conspiracy as she was led away. The headline read, HOA President's Greed Becomes Her Prison. Landmark Case Sets New Precedent. 3 months later at Melanie's sentencing hearing, the courtroom was again packed. The judge's words were scathing. Mrs. Ross, you betrayed the trust of hundreds of families, corrupted public officials, and showed a callous disregard for both the law and basic human decency. This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. As the gavel fell, I thought about Aunt Margaret. Her plan had worked perfectly. She'd known I'd find the legal angle everyone else had missed. Sometimes the best revenge really was living well. But in this case, it was even better. It was turning their own weapon against them. The final pieces fell into place over the next 6 months like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. Melanie Ross received 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. During her sentencing, she stood before the judge, a shadow of her former self, and delivered a statement that made national news. I let greed blind me to the harm I was causing, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I destroyed lives, families, and communities. I can never make full amends, but I hope my cooperation helps bring down others like me. Her testimony had indeed been instrumental in dismantling a network that spanned 12 states and involved over 200 corrupt officials. Jim Harrison got off lighter with 15 years thanks to his early cooperation. He provided detailed financial records that helped recover over $30 million in stolen funds. The real earthquake came when Senator William Thornton's trial began. The man who'd once wielded immense power now sat in the defendant's chair, facing charges that could put him away for life. His fall from grace was Shakespearean in its completeness. From respected lawmaker to the face of political corruption in America, as for the 120 homes, the solution was more elegant than anyone expected. I sold each house back to its current occupant for exactly what they'd paid, minus any kickbacks or fraudulent fees they'd been charged. The environmental cleanup was completed, using funds recovered from the criminal enterprise. The land's value skyrocketed once word got out about the natural gas deposits, but I'd already made arrangements. The mineral rights were placed in a community trust with profits funding local schools and environmental protection programs for the next 50 years. Connell Lewis, my childhood neighbor turned HOA victim, was elected as the new Community Association president. His first act was to rewrite the bylaws, ensuring transparency and requiring supermajority approval for any major decisions. Never again, he told me over coffee one morning. We're going to make this a real community, not a scheme. The manicured lawns I'd hated now bloomed with sunflowers planted by kids. A mural of Aunt Margaret smiled beside the playground, her quote screaming in crimson paint. They wanted a prison? We built a home. Even the HOA approved mailboxes wore DIY glitter. The residents, once suspicious of each other, had bonded over their shared experience. Block parties replaced HOA meetings, and the community garden flourished where Melanie's office once stood. Allison West's trajectory changed overnight. The young lawyer who'd been blacklisted became the go-to expert on property fraud. She opened her own firm specializing in protecting homeowners from predatory HOAs and corrupt developers. Within a year, she had offices in 3 states and a waiting list of clients. I owe it all to your aunt, she told me one day. She saw something in me worth saving. We'd found more of Aunt Margaret's letters hidden in the property. She'd been documenting Melanie's activities for years, building a case she knew she wouldn't live to see completed. Former Judge Harold Winter's testimony had opened another Pandora's box. His detailed accounts of judicial corruption led to a massive Department of Justice investigation. 17 judges across 6 states were indicted, their cases reopened, and hundreds of wrongful foreclosures overturned. Winters died peacefully in his sleep 3 months after testifying, finally at peace with his conscience. His funeral was attended by many of the families he'd helped in his final act of redemption. The ripple effects continued to spread. States began passing new laws to protect property owners from HOA overreach. The Jordan Amendment, as it became known, required multiple forms of verified notification for any HOA action affecting property rights. Law schools added courses on HOA governance and property fraud. The Emerald Heights case became required reading in ethics classes, a cautionary tale of how unchecked power and greed could corrupt entire systems. On the anniversary of Melanie's arrest, I stood in the community center addressing a gathering of residents, local officials, and press. This victory belongs to all of us, I said, looking at the faces that had become familiar over the past year. To everyone who stood up, spoke out, and refused to let corruption win. To my Aunt Margaret who saw this coming and prepared the ground for justice. And to this community which chose unity over division, truth over convenience. After the speeches, as people mingled and shared stories, I found myself standing where my aunt's wildflower field used to be. Now it was a playground filled with laughing children. Their parents watched from nearby benches, no longer worried about mysterious fees or threatened foreclosures. Connell approached, handing me a cold beer. You know, Brian, when you first showed up, some of us thought you were the enemy. Now look at this place. He gestured at the thriving community. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well. As the sun set over Emerald Heights, I thought about the journey from that first shocking morning to this moment of peace. The forensic accountant in me appreciated the neat resolution of debits and credits, justice balancing the scales. But the human in me found deeper satisfaction in the community that had emerged from the ashes of corruption. As I walked back to join the celebration, I could almost hear Aunt Margaret's voice on the evening breeze. Well done, Brian. Well done indeed. The wildflowers were gone, but something even better had taken root. A community built on trust, transparency, and the unshakable belief that justice, though sometimes delayed, will always find a way to prevail. Looking back, I realized that Melanie had been right about one thing. She had fallen into a legal trap, but it wasn't one I had set. It was one she'd built herself, brick by brick, with every fraudulent document, every forged signature, every family she'd tried to destroy. In the end, the very laws she twisted to serve her greed had snapped back like a rubber band, delivering the poetic justice that makes for the best kind of ending, the kind where good guys win, the bad guys pay. And a community discovers that together they're stronger than any corrupt system that tries to tear them apart. 72 hours. That's how long I had to prove 120 homes were built on lies before the bulldozers erased my aunt's legacy forever. And in the end, what would you bury in the desert to survive? Sometimes the best revenge truly is turning their greed into your community's gain. And if you're watching this from a place where HOA horror stories are all too common, remember this. Document everything, question authority, and never underestimate the power of ordinary people united against injustice. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not just my victory, but ours. The victory of every person who's ever felt powerless against a system designed to crush them. We're proof that with persistence, intelligence, and a little help from friends, even the mightiest Goliaths can fall.